Hi, this is Dan Brooks, and today I'm going to talk to you about building efficiently. So, in order to win a game of Dominion, you need to do two things. You need to both have the most victory points and end the game by emptying any three piles, four piles if you're playing with 5+ players. Alternatively, you can empty the province or colony pile. These objectives, at first glance, seem to be in tension with each other because to have victory points, you want to have provinces and colonies in your deck, which will slow you down. But to end the game, you want golds, platinum, markets in your deck to have the buys, coins, and gains to end the game. Um, an important observation is that if you play a high payload deck, a deck that produces 10, 20, 30 coins, um, you can both gain victory points and end the game by emptying piles um, at the same time. You could do something like gain four actions, gain two provinces in the same turn. So high level Dominion revolves around a lot around playing and the threat of high payload decks. And an important question is how to build these high payload decks efficiently. Um, let's say you want to play a deck that hits 20 coins. Can you build that deck by turn 13 instead of turn 15? That's what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, as well as some tactics around selecting decks and playing these decks. So let's quantify payload. Let's say you have a deck that has some number of cards. You draw n of those cards per turn. Each card in your deck produces some number of coins. The payload of your deck, P, is the average coins per turn, which is the average coins produced by a card times the average number of cards that you draw. As an example, the starting deck in Dominion is 7 copper, 3 estates, 10 cards in deck, 5 cards drawn per turn. The average card in this deck produces 0.7 coins, and the average payload of this deck is then 3.5 coins. So we're not going to delve too much into the math, but simply put, like in this framework, you want to maximize P, the coins produced per turn. You can do this by putting better cards in your deck. They produce more coins, and by drawing more cards. I do want to add that here I'm talking about coins. Buys, gains, attack plays all matter too. So this really comes down to doing the most stuff in some general sense. So let's look at different deck types. And I know in the Dominion community that there are a lot of arguments over what decks are named. Don't worry too much about the names. Pay a lot of attention to the number of cards drawn. So here in red and orange, we have decks that don't draw that many cards. So like in red, we see an unimproved deck that draws 5 cards per turn, or a good stuff deck that maybe draws 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cards per turn. And so these decks are good at taking points over time. As an example, if you have a 20 card deck, you add a province, the province goes to the discard. It's going to be at least 3 turns before you see that province again. So the deck slows down not very much. Engines, on the other hand, shown in green, blue, and purple, slow down quite a bit when you add points. And they also build up exponentially quite quickly in a long game. So engines like to build for a long time and then take points in one big spurt or a few big spurts. So let's talk about the growth rate of engines. So in green, we have a draw deck engine where if you have 10 cards in the deck, you draw 10 cards. So maybe you play 5 labs, play 5 gold, get some plus buy in there, buy more labs, buy more gold. And you build up, build up, build up, and eventually take points at the end. So engine 2 is very similar. The difference here is that in a gain and play engine, you actually draw more cards than you have in your deck at the start of the turn. So how can you do that? Maybe you play workshop, gain silver, play workshop, gain silver, play workshop, gain workshop, play smithy, draw silver, silver workshop, play workshop, gain smithy, and then play all your treasure, buy some stuff. And so the point here is that you actually get to gain and play cards in the same turn. There's less of a wait. Gain and play engines tend to build up faster than draw deck engines. Again, because there's less of a wait to play cards, and you can often gain more cards in a turn. One nice thing about engines also is that if you make sure that your engine reliably kicks off, you can set up your draws quite nicely. So you can match villages to terminals. You can make sure that the number of coins matches the number of buys. So you have less of a problem of hoping the shuffler gives you 7 coins. If you can make sure you kick off, you can just have your you get to play your entire deck, and you can tune your deck to the situation that you're in. So there's also loops, which are a form of gain and play engine. The interesting thing about loops is that once you meet the starting conditions for a loop, you gain and play, gain and play, gain and play, and it's efficient enough that you just don't stop until the pile is empty. So an example is if you have upgrade and fortress, you play upgrade, gain upgrade, play upgrade, gain upgrade, play upgrade, gain upgrade, and you keep going until the upgrade pile is empty. So, and again, like the bound, you're not bounded by the number of cards in your deck, you're only bounded by the number of cards in supply. So loops can be thought of as a very efficient form of a gain and play engine. Okay, so this is nice theory. So if you're playing a deck that is good at drawing and gaining cards, you want to green later. If you're playing a deck that is that doesn't draw, you're more able to, you can take points without slowing down as much. Cool. So now let's talk strategy selection. Like, okay, but like given a board, what should I play? The first thing that you want to do when looking at a board is look for the combination of cards that does the most in a turn, like the highest payload turn possible, assuming you could have whatever cards you wanted. So important things to look for are there ways to draw extra cards? Are there villages that give extra actions? Are there ways to buy or gain extra cards? Are there ways to trash bad cards like estates, curses, copper? Are there attacks that slow down my opponent? Are there extra sources of points that will help in a longer game? If these things aren't present, that's a constraint that you need to keep in mind when deck building. For example, if there's no trashing, if you draw a deck, you need to draw 7 copper, 3 estates plus whatever else. So it's important to make sure, like to understand what constraints there are on deck building. Okay, my recommendation is to play the deck with the greatest late game payload that works. So the first part is concrete, like greatest late game payload, okay, but the deck has to work. So why might the deck not work? Maybe there's not enough cards, right? A deck that's trying to play 6 gold won't work if there's no way to draw extra cards. Similarly, if there's no village, a draw deck, a deck that's drawing itself every turn can only play 1 terminal. So you'll need to pick a terminal and play it. Not enough gains. In order to grow exponentially, you need to be able to gain multiple cards in a turn. Otherwise, you're going to see linear growth. Not enough trashing, especially with junking attacks. If there's a witch that's handing out 5 curses per turn, or 5 curses total, those are going to be in your deck. And if there's a bunch of bad cards in your deck, something like a good stuff deck or a slog might play better than an engine if there's not enough cards in supply to draw 15 junk cards every turn. Okay. So the first 4 are constraints on sort of like the hypothetical best deck that you could build. The 5th point is a little bit trickier, and that's unable to score enough points. And so like let's say you're considering playing an engine, like maybe a gain and play engine, and you say, okay, what if my opponent plays a good stuff deck or a slog and they start greening here? So around here, my opponent has, maybe 18 points. They're hitting 7, 8 coins a turn, and I have 15, 20 coins per turn. What the engine deck wants to do there is the engine deck wants to add attacks to slow the money deck down. The engine deck wants to build up while keeping the piles healthy. The engine deck doesn't want the game to end, so the engine deck wants to keep piles healthy, keep the province pile intact, and then maybe go for alternate VP like Gardens, scoring a bunch of points and overtaking the money deck on the last turn. That's the typical tactic. Now it's important to say, is that going to work? If gardens are in supply, that is likely to work because gardens provide a lot of points. But what happens if there is no gardens? Then you need to win on provinces, so then the timing becomes important, right? Maybe you can only let the money deck pick up 5 provinces, and then you pick up 3 provinces, 4 duchies, and a state to overtake that. But that's sort of like the engine versus money matchup, and it can go both ways. Typically, engine is favorite, assuming if all the engine components are available. Engines typically can find ways to outmaneuver money. If a key component is missing, like trashing, or if there's no alt VP, then it depends on the board. It depends on the situation. But let's come back to the goal. The goal is to end the game with the most victory points. So in the engine versus money matchup, it's important to have a plan to end the game with the most victory points. So, for engine, that might be keep the game going, build up really big and then score at the end. For money, playing against engine, you might say, okay, well, I want to empty piles somehow. So one example of that might be buy province, remodel a province into a province, to take a province out of supply to lower the province pile by 2 every turn. That could be a tactic without alt VP that sort of threatens to empty the province pile and threatens to end the game against engine. And threatening to end the game is something that generally you want to do. So another example is let's say you're playing a board with Witch and the curse pile runs out. So now 1 pile's gone. And your opponent's playing engine, so they gain a bunch of villages. You gain a few. Now the village pile's gone. So now you only need to empty 1 more pile to end the game. And maybe you have a bunch of curses and you go for gardens and you start lowering the gardens pile. That's a threat that will end the game. So that's good. But I think it is important, sort of regardless of what strategy you're going for, to keep in mind that one, you need to have victory points, but 2, you need a concrete way of ending the game. And when in doubt, like if you're not sure and the engine seems good, generally high payload decks have more options and they have more ways of emptying, and they tend to do quite well later on. So when in doubt, I definitely recommend going with a high payload deck. And if it doesn't work, then hey, you can figure out why it doesn't work and know not to go for it again in that situation, or know to play it a little bit better. Okay, so this is deck selection. So go for a deck that works. Go for high late game payload. Now let's talk a little bit about tactics during the game. So there's 3 stages of the game, at least in my view. The first is the early game where you're trying to draw deck. So start by prioritizing trashing, copper, estates, curses. Cycling is good, like cellar, warehouse, draw actions, treasures that you're gaining more quickly. And add economy for key purchases. So let's say you decide that you want to get a witch in the first few turns of the game, a good attack. That costs 5, so you want just enough economy to hit 5. So maybe you buy 1 silver, maybe a poacher, you hit 5, you get your witch. After you get your witch, You want to keep your deck lean, so focus on trashing, focus on cycling now that you've gotten your witch. So add just enough economy to buy the cards you want early game, but no more. Okay. The mid game begins when you draw a deck. So maybe you play your witch, you play village, you play witch, your deck's now 8 cards, you draw the 8 cards. Cool. Now every turn you want to gain cards that make your deck better. So maybe you buy like a lab and a gold in the same turn, and then you buy like lab, gold, or market. Uh, you want to draw deck, like if you're playing a draw deck engine, you want to make sure you're drawing deck every turn. So if you add, a stop card, be sure to add a little bit of extra draw to draw it up. You also get to pair your villages with terminals, which is nice. The second point is reliability, in that if there's some way to make sure that you have a village in your starting, like if you need a village to start your turn, maybe play a few extra villages, maybe play a few extra labs, a little bit of extra draw, to make sure so that you build up a little bit slower, but you have less dead turns. So reliability is something to think about. There's a transition from the mid game to the late game when your opponent threatens to end the game. So maybe your opponent's playing engine and piles are starting to get low, and your opponent is starting to threaten a 3 pile. Or maybe you're playing against a money deck and the money deck starts to take provinces. So now you need to think about what your plan is to score points and also to empty piles yourself. So the first rule of thumb is to look for how the game might end, which piles, like provinces, villages, curses, that sort of thing, and look for any immediate wins that you have. Again, this gets a lot easier if you have a lot of coins and a lot of buys. The second thing to do is to prevent your opponent from winning. If you know your opponent has, can empty piles on curses next turn, maybe take a few points so that your opponent can't empty piles for a point lead. If the game isn't going to end next turn, then look at improving your position. This could be either taking some points, adding some payload to your deck, or perhaps adding a bit of reliability. Cool. And so this is generally how you play the game. With some trashing is important for engine. If you're playing a good stuff deck or a slog deck, you generally want to trash to some extent, but you might prioritize trashing a little bit less. Okay. So earlier on, you made a prediction of how the board would play out. You actually played the game. And now after the game, there's a lot you can learn. Did your predictions pan out? Like you made a decision to try and end the game. Did it work? Did any of the action cards surprise you? When you played the game, think about your trashing. Did your trashing go according to plan? Could you have done something a little bit better? Think about the cards that you saw. One of the interactions that surprised me a couple of days ago was stockpile gamble. I recently made a video on that. And I think a really important one is if you could play the board again, would you play the same deck again? Or maybe would you do something differently? And I think you can learn a lot after the game from thinking through the decisions that you made and how the game played out. And last but not least, have fun. Dominion is a hard game. There's a lot of interesting decisions. And I think if you enjoy it, you'll naturally tend to think about it a bit more and perhaps play a little bit better in the long run. That's all for me. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments.